If you watched my recent War in Middle-earth video on the downfall of Numenor, or had prior knowledge of the topic, you would be aware of how the destruction of Numenor would mark the beginning of the mighty race of Numenoreans gradually fading into legend. But the end of Numenor was not the end of the Numenoreans, and more specifically, it would mark the rise of the Black Numenoreans. But as quickly as they came, the Black Numenoreans also faded into legend. So what actually happened to them? In the latter third of the Second Age, the Numenoreans split into two factions, the King's Men and the Faithful. However, some of those who belonged to the King's Men would go a step further towards the Shadow, and they would end up serving Sauron. This is the third faction of Numenoreans, the Black Numenoreans. Initially, the Black Numenoreans were somewhat of a fringe group, as the vast majority of Numenoreans were opposed to Sauron. This changes when Ar-Pharazôn, last king of Numenor, brings Sauron to Numenor, and at this point those belonging to the King's Men are corrupted by Sauron and begin to worship the darkness as well. Functionally, they're not really different to the Black Numenoreans at this point, but they don't become one and the same until after the downfall of Numenor. Those King's Men who survived in Middle-earth now properly pledge their allegiance to Sauron, or are at least allied to him, therefore properly becoming Black Numenoreans. Their most hated enemies are the Faithful, who have now become the Dunedain of Gondor and Arnor. The downfall of Numenor creates a power vacuum in Numenor's southern colonies, and the Black Numenoreans are quick to take control. Two of the most notable Black Numenorean lords are Herimor and Fëanor, who allied with Sauron in the late Second Age. Many Black Numenoreans take part in the War of the Last Alliance, but they are defeated alongside Sauron, and this defeat shatters their power. They do retain some relevancy, at least until the end of the first millennium of the Third Age, but afterwards they swiftly dwindle and fade from history, at least in the northwest of Middle-earth. So what happened to the Black Numenoreans, and why did this happen? Well, we get some clues and we get some outright facts. Firstly, they're defeated by Gondor. During the early years of the Third Age, Umbar, much of Harad, and possibly lands further to the south are in the hands of Black Numenoreans. Most notably, Baruthiel, who was briefly Queen of Gondor as the wife of King Taranon Falaster, was a Black Numenorian, possibly from Umbar. However, Taranon's successor, Eärnil I, conquered Umbar in 933 of the Third Age, driving the Lords of Umbar, the Black Numenoreans, into exile in Harad. 82 years later, the exiled Lords of Umbar attempted to recapture Umbar, using forces from Harad, but this fails and the Black Numenoreans never recapture Umbar. Umbar is the chief Black Numenorian port, at least in the northwest of Middle-earth, and the loss of Umbar breaks their power. Secondly, the Black Numenoreans aren't just fighting Gondor, they're fighting each other. Faramir offers some insights into this during his talk with Frodo and Sam in the Two Towers. He mentions that Black Numenorean lords ended up growing lazy and fighting with each other, leading to them being conquered by their subject peoples. And this makes sense. The Black Numenoreans served Sauron, but he's out of the picture during the early Third Age. So they're leaderless, they have no centralization, and most importantly, they're exceedingly ambitious. They fight for control over one another and gradually weaken themselves in the process until they are conquered by others. And this leads me to my third point, failed integration. Whereas the Dunedain of Gondor got along with most of their local populations and successfully integrate them into Gondorian society, the Black Numenoreans are the opposite. They rule as tyrants, and the lesser men of Middle-earth haven't forgotten the atrocities the King's Men carried out during the latter half of the Second Age. The moment the Black Numenorian power dwindles, they're overthrown by the native populations, like that of Harad, and they become minorities in the lands they conquered. Once they are minorities or powerless, they are forced to mix with the local populations, diluting their Numenorian blood until they no longer retain any of their Numenorian gifts. And finally, general decline. This is something that the Dunedain experience as well, but there is evidence that would suggest that the Black Numenoreans who served darkness would end up suffering this decline quicker, as the King's Men did once they started serving Sauron. So although the initial generations of Black Numenoreans might retain some of their Numenorian gifts, it's likely that latter generations would decline more rapidly until they are no different from normal men. All of these factors contributed to the decline of the Black Numenoreans as a power in the northwest of Middle-earth. That's not to say that there isn't Black Numenoreans who still rule lands far to the south or east by the end of the Third Age, but if they do, they don't play a part in the events concerning the northwest, and they don't play a part in the War of the Ring. However, although I've spoken of the Black Numenorean decline, it does not mean they were extinct. There were at least some Black Numenoreans left in the northwest by the end of the Third Age, the most notable being the mouth of Sauron. There might be small communities of them remaining, or groups that trace their bloodline well enough to consider it still pure, much like the Dunedain of the North or the Dunedain of Gondor. It's very likely that the Mouth of Sauron is part of one of those groups. But are the Black Numenoreans the leaders and tyrants they used to be in places like Umbar and Harad? No, and although many of the men of Harad or Umbar might be in part descended from Black Numenoreans, they're not actually Black Numenoreans anymore. Despite their relatively minimal appearance in Tolkien's works, Black Numenoreans are a favourite amongst adaptations. In the Lord of the Rings Online, they appear extensively in many places. In War in the North, the main villain is a Black Numenorean. In Shadow of Mordor, two of the main villains are Black Numenoreans. In Divide and Conquer, one of the fan favourite factions is Ar-Adunaim, a Black Numenorian kingdom from the south. In other words, despite barely receiving a few paragraphs, people really love Black Numenoreans, and future makers of future adaptations should maybe take note. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it or found it interesting. Like many other people, the Black Numenoreans are one of my favourite parts of Tolkien's world, and I froth over their inclusion in any adaptations. War of the Last Alliance is next, and remember, if a literal god sinks your homeland and kills everyone on it, maybe use that opportunity to repent instead of doubling down on evil.